people that are not on the call right now, they can watch a recording later on YouTube. And yeah, so with that, thank you for joining. Welcome, everyone. Gianluca will give a brief overview of what Svelto is for the people that are new, and then we will go talk about the two ways Sveltos works, mode 1 and mode 2, and what are the differences when somebody should use one versus another. And then we will go do a little bit deep dive into the new feature release that is all about mode 2 and agentless mode. And throughout all of that, Gianluca is going to demo most of what he's going to talk about. So demo heavy, very visual presentation. Hopefully it will work. And again, if you have any questions, feel free to raise your hand and I'll make you a participant. And that doesn't work, and chat doesn't work, we always have Slack. You can always ask questions on Slack. Perfect. With that, I'll pass the ball to Gianluca for the presentation. Gianluca, take it away.
Hey everybody. Thank you. So I just want to just 2 slides because I want to spend most of the time on a live demo. And just those 2 slides to explain what Sveltos is. Sveltos, it's a set of controllers that run in a management cluster. And from this management cluster can manage application and add-ons on a set of managed clusters. Those clusters can be cluster API power clusters. Use cluster API to create your own cluster. Sveltos automatically discovers cluster API. So if cluster API is also running in the management cluster, there is nothing else that you have to do. Just label your class properly, and Sveltos will discover those clusters and deploy application and add-ons. But if you have any other type of clusters, you can simply register with Sveltos, and I will register one Sivo cluster to show like how easy that is using the Sveltos Kaggle, which is Sveltos CLI, but that is not required. You can even register a cluster by programmatically creating the 2 Kubernetes resources that are needed to register a cluster with Sveltos. And this is a flow of how the idea of how Sveltos works. Again, Sveltos is running in the management cluster, and those are your managed clusters, which are already registered with Sveltos at the point. There is one concept that Sveltos has. It's a Sveltos introduced like few custom resource definition. One of those is a cluster profile. A cluster profile is a cluster selector that selects clusters based on their labels. In this case, is selecting all the clusters which have label environment production. And then it has a section, in this case, it has a section where I'm listing all the uncharts that I want to deploy. YAML can be deployed as well as customize Sveltos and support for all of those. This is the V1 alpha slide, so apologies for that. The cluster selector is slightly different, but the concept doesn't change in V1 beta 1. It's again selecting a set of clusters based on their labels. So because at this point, none of the managed clusters is matching this cluster selector, Sveltos is doing nothing. But as soon as I add the label environment production to this workload cluster, Sveltos detected this is a match, and it takes all the add-ons that are listed, applications that are listed in this cluster profile, and deploys all of them. In this case, Caverna is deployed in this cluster. And same things happen if I, add the same label on the environment production on the second cluster. As soon as I do that, the cycle repeats. Sveltos detects this cluster is a match and deploys Caverna. The default behavior, if you remove the label from a cluster, so if a cluster is not matching a cluster profile, the default behavior is to withdraw all the applications and add-ons that have been deployed. But this is configurable. There is a setting in Sveltos where you can tell Sveltos to leave what he has deployed on those clusters when a cluster is not matching. That will be the case where you are preparing a cluster and then you are handing it over to somebody else. So you just want to make sure that when you hand it over, the right set of add-ons and applications are deployed, but from that point on, somebody else is in charge of it. So this is just like 2 slides, very brief, because I want to spend most of the time on the live demo. And what I have in this case, it's and make the font a little larger. Hopefully it's good. I do have a kind cluster locally, which I'm using as my management cluster. And so I have deployed Sveltos, and I also have deployed cluster API, but it doesn't really matter for the this demo. What matters is like Sveltos is deployed here. And I have registered already some clusters. I do have 4 clusters at this point. I have a GK cluster, which is in the namespace production. And I have 2 Sivo clusters, which I'm using as stage cluster. The Sveltos cluster in the management namespace called management represents the cluster where Sveltos is running. So Sveltos automatically registers the cluster where it's running, and because Sveltos can manage add-ons and application in the management cluster as well. It's at the end, it's just yet another Kubernetes cluster, and as long as you put the right set of labels, Sveltos can deploy stuff in this cluster as well. I do have another kubeconfig. This is the kubeconfig of a Sivo 3 cluster that I have created and not yet registered with Sveltos. And I want to show you how using Sveltos Cabal, how simple it is to register this cluster. The command is simply like this Sveltos Cabal. I should have copied the binary here, but Sveltos Cabal, register cluster. And then you specify in which namespace you want to register the cluster. The name of the cluster, I'm going to use Sivo cluster 3 in this case, and the kubeconfig clusters this cluster and what labels I want to add to this cluster here, environment functional verification. As soon as I run this command, the cluster has been registered. And if I go and check back, you see that the Sivo cluster 3 is now present. Sveltos automatically discovers the version that this cluster is running. I have created clusters all with different versions just to show pretty much that I'm actually using different clusters. It's not the same cluster behind the scene. What this command does, to register a cluster with Sveltos, Sveltos Cabal is just a utility that you can use, but you don't have to. There are many folks who will programmatically register their cluster with Sveltos. At the end, it's just a matter of creating one Sveltos cluster instance. Sveltos cluster is another CRD that Sveltos introduced. And if we look at one of those, the most important setting, essentially, so we can look at one of those. There are a few settings that you can set, but in this case, the status is reported by Sveltos. It's healthy because you can talk to this cluster. It detects the version of the cluster is running and is setting it here. And Sveltos expects the secret to have a very specific name. The name of the secret containing the kubeconfig to access the cluster, it's supposed to be it's supposed to be the name of the cluster and then the postfix Sveltos kubeconfig. It doesn't have to be this. This is where Sveltos by default expect the secrets containing the kubeconfig to access the cluster to be named, but it doesn't have to be. You can give it any name, and there is a field in the Sveltos cluster spec where you can say like, this is the name of my secret containing the kubeconfig to access the cluster. So you can use that one as well. Now, right now I have deployed Sveltos in Sveltos has 2 modes of deployment, mode 1 and mode 2. Now I deployed in mode 1. I will spend some time at the end explaining what mode 2, the Agentless Mode is, which is the new mode that we are introducing. In this mode, what Sveltos does, it creates an agent. It deploys an agent in every managed cluster. So right now I'm pointing to Sivo 3, the cluster that I just registered. And if I go there and see, there is this agent here which Sveltos has deployed. This is the mode 1. when we go in mode 2, like this agent is not going to be there anymore, and I will explain after at the end of the demo what is going to happen in the agentless mode. But in this mode here, this agent is running in the cluster. It's running like in every cluster, and this is used for event. Sveltos is an event framework, so you can tell Sveltos if an event happens, detect an event of a certain type, and when the event happens, what to do in response, deploy other application or add-ons. This is the component that detects events in a given cluster. Now, to ask Sveltos to deploy something, I have prepared like some configuration, and this is, for instance, how can I tell Sveltos to deploy Ser Manager in every cluster, which has this label here, environment function application, and simply passing the Helm chart, where is the repository URL, the name, the version, and the release name and release namespace where I want to deploy it. I can deploy I can list multiple Helm charts, and what Sveltos can do is going to deploy those one after the other. So in this case, I'm listing 2 Helm charts, and Sveltos will deploy Prometheus first and Grafana after. So all the Helm charts that are listed in a given cluster profile are deployed one after the other. Sveltos is not limited to. It's not limited to. Sorry, this is long. Sveltos is not limited to Helm charts. You can deploy also YAML, and this is an example where I'm asking Sveltos to deploy some YAML. So you can store the YAML in a config map in a management cluster, and then you can create a cluster profile that reference this config map. In this case, I'm telling Sveltos, find all the clusters that have this label, environment function verification, and deploy the content of this config map. The config map is called disallow letter stack, and the disallow letter stack config map contains in its data section a Caverno cluster policy. So Sveltos is going to deploy this one. I'm going to apply whatever I have in this directory, and while I do that, I'll go to the dashboard. I want to also show the dashboard, and so Sveltos at this point is deploying, like, this is the Sveltos dashboard, and Sveltos at this point is deploying all the add-ons and applications that they ask it to deploy in every cluster. So in this, we can see all the clusters that Sveltos is currently managing, and the version of every cluster and the namespace where those clusters are. So if I go to the GK cluster, for instance, now I can see that those Helm charts are being deployed, and I can see what resources are being deployed. No resources deployed yet, because there is the way I deploy the way that I deploy the cluster profile, it has a depends field. But I can see pretty much for every cluster, I can see all the cluster profiles that are matching the cluster. I can see what the status is, and I can see all the Helm charts that are being deployed, and which resources are being deployed, no resources are deployed yet. So we can wait for, more things have been deployed here. These are the resources, the cluster policy that I asked, like the YAML that I asked Sveltos to deploy. The reason Sveltos in this case, like it's doing things in the order that I specified. If I want to see the order, I can go to the profile section. And for instance, if I select the deploy Caverno cluster profile, I can see that the deploy Caverno depends on cert manager, which means that Sveltos won't deploy the deploy Caverno till cert manager has been deployed by Sveltos. And I can see that there are other 3 cluster profiles that deploy that depends on deploy Caverno. So the external DNS, the deploy Caverno resources, because clearly I cannot deploy the Caverno cluster policy unless Caverno has been deployed on the cluster, and Prometheus and Grafana. This is just, there is really no dependency between Prometheus and Caverno. I just have like this dependency to show that it's very easy to set the dependency, to specify dependency in Sveltos, because it's at the end, it's just go back at this one. When you are creating a cluster profile, there is a field depends on when you can list all the other cluster profiles that this cluster profile depends on. And so Sveltos will wait before deploying this one for all those to be deployed. And this is per cluster. In this mode, if I go back to the cluster, I can see that I should be able to see that Sveltos has also deployed another component, which is the drift detection. So this component here is the one that understands what resources Sveltos has deployed. And if something changed because someone manually modifies one of those resources going directly to the managed cluster, Sveltos detected as a configuration drift and going to revert this change back, reapplying again the configuration that it's defining the management cluster. So I don't know if I'm going like too fast. I'm trying to stay within the 30 minutes. So if there are questions, I think it's to time, or if I'm going too fast, just please let me know. We have 30 minutes and I'm trying not to use every second. So in this, I want to show the one more thing before we go to the mods. I asked Sveltos to deploy this component here, Nginx, using a configuration drift. So if we look at the cluster profiles existing, there's one cluster profile which is deploying Nginx. And if we look at this cluster profile, we can see that there is a mod which is set to continuous with drift detection. What this mod means, this is telling Sveltos, whatever I ask you to deploy in this cluster profile should stay on the managed cluster. If someone goes to the managed cluster and modifies it or deletes it, you have to put it back. So if I take this Nginx deployment and I delete it, so I'm pointing directly to the managed cluster and I'm deleting this deployment here. So again, I'm doing this while pointing directly to the managed cluster. As soon as I do that, Sveltos is going to detect that now the state of this managed cluster has drifted compared to the state that I declared that I declared in the management cluster. And the management cluster has said that the Nginx deployment must be there. And now, because someone has permission going directly to this cluster to delete it, it drifted from this expected state. So now, if I go and really it in the Nginx. Yeah, of course, like this is a demo, and so it's not working. In this case here, like Sveltos will detect the state and will put it back. The important part is that deployment project Sveltos namespace. The important part, like it's good, I want to highlight is that in this mod here, this is the mod 1 that I'm running. In mod 1, Sveltos has put those two components in the management, in every managed cluster. But there is this other mod that Sveltos has, which it's, sorry, when you deploy Sveltos, there is the getting started, installation. There is this mod 2. This mod 2, it's what we call like Agentless Mode. And what Sveltos does when you run it in this mod 2, it doesn't put anything in the managed cluster. All the components that the Sveltos agents and the drift detections are deployed in the management cluster for every cluster. That it's a mod that you should use if essentially you are preparing, if you are preparing a cluster that you are renting to somebody else, usually who rents the cluster from you, wants to pay only like for his own application. It doesn't want anything else to run like in that cluster because it's paying for CPU and memory that is consuming that cluster. So if you are preparing a cluster and you're handing over this cluster to renting this cluster to a tenant or a customer of yours, then the mode 2 is the preferred mode, because in that case, like Sveltos is not going to put anything in this cluster. Everything is going to run in the management cluster. So it's the customer is only going to pay like for all that for his own application. He's not going to pay for anything else. I did not install Sveltos in this mode because ideally what I would love to do is to do, and I see that Dario's here, to have like another webinar with Dario and Adriano from Clastic and show the combination of Kamaji plus Sveltos, because what Kamaji allows you to do is to have the control plane of your managed cluster running as pod in the management cluster. So if you have the combination of Kamaji plus Sveltos, then you have everything is in the management cluster. And the managed cluster, the only things that you can see is the application and the add-ons that the customer wants to run in his own cluster. So hopefully we will soon have another session where we demo together Kamaji and Sveltos. But this is the main difference. If the clusters are yours and there is really, it's really up to you. I don't see like pro and cons between like those two modes, local mode or centralized agent mode. You pick which one you want. If you are creating a cluster and renting to a tenant, then I suggest you pick this mode here, because it makes the tenant happy. When he goes, he can see only his own application running there. He's happy. And also the tenant at that point, he cannot make any mistake. He cannot go and delete the Sveltos agents or the drip detection agent causing like any problem. And we do have 5 minutes left, and I think it's time to open for question. Simone? Simone, you're muted.
Hi. Thank you for the presentation. So with the centralized agent mode, I observed that there was some Sveltos CRDs that were also being deployed in the managed cluster. So with this mode, we will have those CRDs in the management cluster as well?
So when you go like to the agentless mode with the new release, there will be no deployment belonging to Sveltos, no CRD belonging to Sveltos, no custom resource belonging to Sveltos. All those are moved to the management cluster. And so there is actually no Sveltos footprint in any managed cluster.
Okay, so the difference between mode 2 and the new mode is that the CRDs
So
are
Mode 2, we had like Mode 2 for a while, but in Mode 2, Sveltos was deploying those custom resources in the managed cluster. Now those custom resources, also those are moved like to the management cluster. So there is zero footprint of Sveltos starting from the new release when in this mode in any managed cluster.
Okay. Yeah, that makes sense. Thank you.
Right. Any other questions or ideas? Comments? Other things that
Hopefully
you'd
it
like to
didn't go
see?
too fast.
Oh, I think we have one more from Jim. Go ahead, Jim.
Hi. Yeah, thank you. I guess quick question. If you are using mode 1 for a deployed cluster and you want to move over to mode 2, how disruptive might that be?
I need to get back to you on that because I never tested that scenario.
Okay.
For sure, I can tell you that you will have to manually remove the resources from the managed clusters because, upgrading from mode 1, going to mode 2, taking care of that part may be like too complex to do. So, but I'll get back to you on that one. I need
Okay,
to.
so
I honestly
basically,
never, because the deploy that I test on every release is like if you are on, I test the upgrade, but from mode 1 to mode 1 and from mode 2 upgrade to mode 2. I don't test like the mix upgrade, switching from one mode to the other.
so rephrasing the question a bit, if you are using mode 1, then I'm trying to think of this now. There's no compelling reason if you're a happy mode 1 user. There's no reason to go to mode 2. There's no, I guess, architectural or security concerns in that regard.
No. Again, if you are creating those clusters for yourself or your company, right? I would say that essentially, if you're happy with mode 1, stick with mode 1. There is absolutely no reason to switch to mode 2. Mode 2, I suggest mode 2 if you are renting if you are managing clusters and renting those clusters to tenant, and they might complain like, oh, like you're making me pay for this Sveltos agents, which is running like in my cluster. Why should I pay for it? Then that's why like mode 2 is probably better in that scenario. So they pay for what they rent, essentially.
Excellent. Thank you very much.
All right, we have Cyril that has another question.
Yeah, thanks for the great presentation. I was wondering, what's the load difference between mode 1 and mode 2? I mean, CPU memory wise.
Well, mode 2, you have to clearly, because in mode 1, you're putting those agents in the managed cluster, while in mode 2, you're putting those agents in the management cluster. Clearly, if you're managing like hundreds of clusters and you are in mode 2, now you need to make sure that there are enough resources on mode 2 for those two components to be scheduled, right? At the end, with Sveltos in mode 2, you might have up to 2 extra pods per managed cluster in your management cluster. So you need to have those two components. Really, it's not that they consume a lot because they have watchers. So if nothing happens, if you don't delete the resources that Sveltos has deployed, the drift detection is absolutely doing nothing. And if there are no events, the Sveltos agent only reacts to events, saying like, I detect the event that you want me to detect. So if those events are not there, they are pretty much idle. So they don't consume much. But again, you need, if you're managing hundreds of clusters with Sveltos in mode 2, then you might have up of 2 deployment per managed cluster running in your management cluster. So make sure that your management cluster has enough resources for those pods to be scheduled.
Got it. And network-wise, I mean, I assume the mode 2 has more dependency on latency and like network traffic than mode 1, or I'm mistaken maybe?
Let's see. So so those agents here, they start a watcher on the API server of the managed cluster. So clearly, if they're running on the managed cluster, it's fast. But I would assume that if you're managing a cluster, you do not have a latency, which is like take seconds for. You don't have like a few seconds delay from management cluster to the managed cluster. So I would assume that there is really no difference over there from that point of view. And of course, like if your management cluster, it's I know it sits in Europe, and your managed cluster sits in California. You may have like like whatever the round trip time. It's based on the bandwidth that you have. But I don't expect for you to notice anything. Also, because the way it works is that those components here, those agents here, detect events or detect the drift, and then every 5 seconds or 10 seconds, I forgot what that cycle is, the add-on controller collect those reports and consume those reports. So I would say, like, I don't expect like you to notice anything, but please let me know if I'll also do a test where I can put my management cluster in Europe and a managed cluster somewhere outside of Europe and see if there is anything that I can notice, but I do not expect.
Thanks. I was just curious. I mean, clearly there is
No, good
some
question.
different way of this communication is there, and basically, if we're talking about CPU memory, it's
Well, at the end, it's those agents. No, it's a good question. At the end, those agents need to watch, but also, even if you are in mode 1, the management cluster has to collect those reports. Those agents just generate the reports, like, oh, I saw these events, or I saw this drift, and then the Sveltos management cluster collect those reports. So there is always a collection that happens. In mode 1, the management cluster is collecting from the managed cluster, while the agents are directly in the managed cluster, and they are, closer to the API server. Then the collection happens from the management cluster in mode 1. So, this phase has still to reach the API server. In mode 2, the agents are watching the API server from the management cluster, but then the collection of reports is within the management cluster. So that part is faster. So I would say that it balances at the end. So probably I wouldn't expect to see any difference.
okay. Thanks for the presentation.
Thank you.
All right, well, it looks like we have no more questions. So thank you, Gianluca, for the great presentation. And thank you, everyone, for joining. And if you have any further questions, please feel free to jump to Slack. You can ask them there. And if you have ideas for the new webinar or something that you're going to come up with in the future, let us know. But yeah, we have more webinars coming up in the next few weeks to deep dive and demo other features of Project Sveltos. So thanks again, and see you next time.
Thank you.
Thank you.